Deprogramming. Both Ross and Hassan were active members of the anti-cult organization Cult Awareness Network, CAN, which ceased to exist in 1996, as it was convicted of a number of gross violations of human rights and severe religious discrimination. The organization went bankrupt and paid compensation to the people who had suffered from it, being the leading members of this organization in the 1980s and 90s. Both Rick Ross and Steven Hassan were actively involved in its primary criminal activity, arranging and carrying out forcible deprogramming processes. Deprogramming is an illegal anti-human practice rooted in Nazi methods. When practicing deprogramming, anticultists would unlawfully abduct and forcibly detain a person whom they considered to be a cult member or a sectarian. In the process of deprogramming, the victim was subjected to psychological and physical torture to force them to change their beliefs. Deprogramming was done on a commercial basis. Anticultists charged a fairly high fee from the victim's relatives for their forcible re-education services, during which a person usually underwent torture, torments, beatings, and various forms of violence, including sexual violence. Since this practice severely violated human rights, the founder of this method, Ted Patrick, appeared in court many times and served prison terms. In a number of trials, courts have ruled that deprogramming is illegal. Rick Ross, the American anticultist, performed more than 500 forcible deprogramming sessions in his life. In 1991, Ross was charged with unlawful detention and forcible deprogramming of Jason Scott, a member of the United Pentecostal Church International, UPCI, whose mother was referred to Ross by representatives of CAN. Scott later filed a civil suit against Ross, two of his associates in CAN, in federal court. In September 1995, a 9-member jury unanimously held the defendants, Ross and his accomplices, liable for conspiracy to deprive Scott of his civil rights and religious liberties. In addition, the jury held that Ross and his associates, quote, intentionally or recklessly acted in a way so outrageous in character and so extreme in degree as to go beyond all possible bounds of decency and to be regarded as atrocious and utterly intolerable in a civilized community. Ross's criminal activities in this abduction case resulted in the closure of the Cult Awareness Network, which was exposed as a criminal network for kidnappers. The story of Scott, who became a victim of brutal deprogramming arranged by Ross, is striking in its cruelty. He was abducted using physical force. They knocked him down to the ground, dragged him into a van, handcuffed him, taped his mouth, and tied his legs. During the abduction, a 300-pound man sat on Scott's back. Scott's legs, upper body and back, suffered multiple bruises and abrasions when he was being dragged into the van by stairs, on the floor, and through a patio. Scott was detained in a specially equipped prison house under constant supervision. For 5 days, he was subjected to psychological pressure. They insulted his faith and threatened him. Ross regularly hit Scott on the head when they argued about religion. Scott was promised freedom only if he would give up his beliefs. A detailed study of the effective cases of deprogramming carried out by Rick Ross reveals the terrible truth. Many of those cases were accompanied by destruction of families and complete dehumanization of the victims. The people whom he allegedly helped in this way were subjected to coercion, deception, and humiliation. They were deprived of their right to free choice and forced to renounce deeply rooted religious beliefs. These people who were broken and lost faith became living evidence of the cruelty and treachery of Ross's methods. His demonstrative successes in deprogramming were covered with a shadow of ruined destinies and irreparable psychological traumas. Ross used people's fears and weaknesses with cold logic in order to profit from their troubles, demonstrating complete indifference to the suffering he caused. His actions are clearly characterized by violence, cruelty, and cold-bloodedness that turn people's misfortune into a source of his own benefit. The second figure and henchman of anti-cult movement in America is deprogrammer Steven Hassan. American mass media give him a platform to speak as a cult expert. But they do not mention that Steve Hassan's expertise is violent abuse against American citizens and their civil rights.
Hassan was an accomplice in the Cult Awareness Network. This anti-religious hate group served as a national referral service for so-called deprogrammers. They ran a racket to kidnap, assault, and traumatize law-abiding men and women for profit, all to coerce them into recanting their religious beliefs. And Steve Hassan is a notorious deprogrammer. Hassan led the squad that traumatized one adult victim, Arthur Roselle, for 2 weeks to try and break the man's faith. In sworn testimony, Roselle recounted his physical and mental assault. Hassan's team threw him to the floor, cutting and bruising his face. They bound his hands and feet and held him captive for days on end. They deprived him of sleep and violated his privacy and basic dignity. When Roselle refused to recant his religious beliefs, Hassan threatened to inject him with shots. And to add insult to injury, Hassan tried to induce his victim to lie and commit perjury about the crime. Then there was the testimony of Lauren Sala. Hassan's team broke into her motel room, threw her from the bed, and threatened to break her leg if she called for help or tried to escape. They took her hostage and drove her to a remote hideaway, where they imprisoned her for 8 days, trying to break her faith. When Hassan's thugs failed, he tormented Salah for 3 more days, until she managed to negotiate her release. Another of Hassan's victims, Claire Kelly, also testified that Hassan unlawfully held her captive. He had her held in a room with no knobs on the windows, kept her under 24-hour guard, and violated her privacy. Hassan pawned himself off as a, quote, expert on religions in court cases, bilking unsuspecting families for his so-called expert testimony, until courts caught on to his crackpot theories. Hassan would continue his anti-religious assaults, now under the name of intervention.
It is excessively alarming and suspicious that despite documented evidence that both Hassan and Ross are violent individuals prone to sadism, who lack empathy and have an unhealthy desire to harm people and incite hatred in society, they continue to appear on America's mainstream TV channels. There, their articles are published in leading periodicals, and mass media are guided by their opinions. A legitimate question arises: who is behind them and ensures their immunity? What is the force that manipulates and supports them? After all, in the beginning of their work before the early 90s days, neither Rick Ross nor Steven Hassan were of much interest with their theories. However, starting from 1993, the media and even the FBI suddenly began to turn to them for advice. Did they conduct their destructive activities and perform deprogramming sessions simply because they were maniacs? Or did their actions contribute to implementation of a clearly defined plan of the enemy of democracy, which has brought America to the current state of panic and division? Both statements are true. The global enemy regarded the manic potential of these two fellows as a suitable material for turning them into its pawns who are easy to manipulate and whose hands can destroy America from within. Activities of American representatives of the anti-cult movement are part of a planned strategy. Both Steve Hassan and Ross are executors of the plans of America's enemy. What they currently implement, continuing to promote and impose the ideology of hatred and division, is nothing but information terrorist attacks aimed against the American population and against the USA as a country. Even though they stopped using violent deprogramming techniques with their own hands, they receive support from the global enemy of democracy. So today, they continue deprogramming on an even larger scale and against a greater number of innocent law-abiding citizens. It's just that now, they are not doing it with their own hands, but with your hands and the hands of law enforcement agencies. A vivid illustration is that 30 years ago, in the early 90s, the number of violent raids on new religious movements increased dramatically and inexplicably for many people. Research that established this fact included statistics from 19 different countries, including the USA, Israel, and Western European countries. Wondering about the reasons behind such an upsurge, researchers traced a mobilization of anti-cult organizations, which occurred during that very period of time. However, the main essence and cause remained hidden for the researchers. The clue is that during this period of time, to be more precise in 1993, the global enemy of democracy activated its ideological center of the anti-cult movement, which has been located in Russia since that moment to this day. It is exactly from there that commands are given from, and a single ideological vector is set for the entire anti-cult movement worldwide, extending to its entire network. Now, using the example of this ideological center, let's discuss in detail how it operates in the country that it has turned into a testing ground for practicing its methods, which it plans to transfer and apply throughout the world in the near future.